માલી સાહેબ ઓલ ધ બેસ્ટ.
હા, એમાં કરી દો લાઈવ અને પેલામાં જઈને મને હોસ્ટ બી આપી દેજો, એટલે હું પેલાને બી હોસ્ટિંગ આપી દઉં, હોસ્ટ આપી દઉં. અત્યારે તમે જે લાઈવ કરશો પેલા નિખિલ દાતાર લાઈવ કરી દો પેલા. હા, અને પેલું હા એટલે પેલામાં મને બીજામાં તમે હોસ્ટ આપી દીધો બરોબર, અને આને બી બનાવી દો, વિશાંક મહેતાને બી એમાં બનાવી દેજો હોસ્ટ. હા બસ, હવે આમાં નિખિલ દત્તાર લાઈવ કરી દો.
હા સર. ઓકે સર. ઓકે 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 સર. ઓકે સર. ઓકે.
Hello, Abhijit.
हाँ sir.
Just take get a water bottle.
Okay sir. Yeah.
Live started. Good to go.
प्रशांत जी चालू करूं?
हाँ जी, हाँ जी.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Myself, Dr. Abhijit Malvi. I am medical advisor at Intas Pharmaceutical Limited. Being a science-driven pharmaceutical company, Intas is always at the forefront in providing educational platforms. During this time of social distancing, webinar is the best platform for getting knowledge from experts. We are daily hearing the word "be safe from Corona." Our webinar topic is also in the same line of safety, that is be safe medico-legally. And expert with us is Dr. Nikhil Datar. Dr. Nikhil Datar is MD, DNB, Medical Director and Gynecologist at Cloud9 Hospital, Mumbai. He is a noted health right activist and founder of Patient Safety Alliance. The nation knows him of his judicial activism around the women's right of abortion. He has challenged the government of India in Supreme Court on behalf of one of his patients. He was instrumental in recent verdict of Supreme Court in which the woman was allowed to terminate her pregnancy at 24 weeks. He is a medical legal director and senior gynecologist at Cloud9 Hospital, Mumbai, the chain of Cloud9 Hospitals by Kids India Private Limited. He is a partner at Lifewave Hospital, Malad, Yashoda Hospital, Goregaon, ex-unit head and postgraduate medical teacher at R.N. Cooper Municipal Hospital. He is a founder president of Patient Safety Alliance, an NGO that works on empowering patients and supporting healthcare professions to prevent medical errors. He has fought famous case for his patient Nikita Mehta, challenging the MTP Act in 2008. We all remember that she was carrying an abnormal fetus and had approached Bombay High Court seeking permission to abort the fetus. His case has paved the way for amendment of MTP Act. He was interviewed in famous TV show Satyamev Jayate by Amir Khan for his extraordinary work on gender sensitive protocol on examination and evidence collection of survivors of sexual assault. He was invited for national consultation appointed on high level committee by WHO and Government of India on national think tank. He was awarded a fellowship by International Federation of Health and Human Rights Organizations in 2010. He was recipient of prestigious Commonwealth Fellowship from UK and worked on patient safety in UK and WHO in 2009. He sits on an advisory board of Asian Center for Entertainment and Education along with eminent Bollywood personalities, recipient of Purandare Gold Medal and Dastur Gold Medal during the academic career. Now, without further delay, I will turn the time to Dr. Nikhil Datar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Abhijit Malvi, Senior Medical Advisor at Intas. And I welcome on behalf of Intas all the colleagues across the country who have joined me for this webinar. And let me kind of first of all wish you to be very, very safe in your homes because of the threat of corona. And we are going to now talk about another very important threat that we all have to face as a part and parcel of our medical profession, that is medical legal problems. And I am going to start discussing some very relevant and some very important issues which we commonly come across. The plan that I have made in this whole 1 hour seminar that we are supposed to conduct is that we are at about 4:10. So I will be speaking for about 30 to 35 minutes. And in the meantime, I will be receiving lots of questions, I'm very sure. As a matter of fact, I can understand that there have been few questions which have already reached even before I've started my presentation. So I would request all the delegates, all the colleagues and all the friends to write to us or on your chat, all the questions that come into your mind, and let me try and solve them as many as possible. Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir. Sir, आपका चालू है.
No, because in between it got disconnected, so I was a bit unsure. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So in between, so I am given to understand that there are already 300 people odd who are already onto this webinar, and I'm very sure that many more probably will be joining down the line. Am I right, Vijay bhai, Prashant bhai?
Yes, sir. Perfectly okay, sir.
All right. So let me first start with my presentation, and then down the line we will be going ahead and taking the questions. So let me share my screen first, and let me start with my presentation to begin with, and let's take it from there forward. All right, brilliant. So are you all able to see the slides? Can the organizers tell me whether they can see the slides well?
Yes, sir. Perfectly okay, sir.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. When we talk of medical legal problems, practically speaking, this is what happens to me. I mean, you can understand that this is my picture, but minusing the bald, many of you might not be having the bald, but still the situation remains to be the same, that you keep on scratching your head all the time as to whether it's a good idea to do a particular thing or not to do a particular thing. And that is exactly the reason for which we are here on this seminar. So today, what I'm going to talk of is some very, very relevant and very, very, very common issues that we come across. And I'm going to give snippets because actually speaking, each one of these are supposed to be, needed to be kind of dealt with in almost like each of them should be dealt with 1 hour kind of a presentation or a talk. But I'm going to summarize everything together as quickly and as crisply as possible in this time frame that we have got. So we are going to talk of death. We are going to talk of giving the death certificate. What are the do's and don'ts? We are going to talk of complicated, serious situations, serious patients in clinic. We are going to talk of record maintenance. We are going to talk of when to inform the police. MTP and PCP NDT is a common green zone for all medical legal people to talk on. Lastly, we are going to talk of what do you do when somebody faces a medical legal notice or somebody gets a legal notice. And then during the course of the question and answer session, I'm sure that we will be dealing with many newer issues like telephonic consultation, because that is what is allowed now by the Board of Governors. As we all know that the Medical Council of India is suspended. So Board of Governors is supposed to be in place. And in the corona situation, we all have been advised and told, and it has been made legal that one can give telephonic consultation. So we will be trying and dealing with few of those do's and don'ts as regard this particular issue is concerned. This is typically a situation of a doctor. Here you can see a doctor and you can see a patient who is unfortunately dead. The doctor has spent, practically speaking, maybe sleepless nights and days trying to treat this particular patient, but somehow this patient is dead. This doctor is already overwhelmed with the kind of a situation that he has got. He does not understand that in spite of doing his level best, why has he lost the patient? And he's unhappy, obviously, about it. And to add to his misery, you have all those people that you can see at the background. Okay, these are the next door doctor, the politician, the reporter, maybe the police, donkeys, cats, dogs, everybody practically pointing finger at him and trying to blame him for whatever that has happened. Currently, the situation is of this sort that people have almost forgotten that human beings can die because of natural causes, or they can die as a consequence of natural causes like diseases, but they die in the hospitals because of doctors. Okay, so it is what is the cause of death? The cause of death is the doctor, not the natural disease or a calamity. And it is so relevant and so evident that we recently heard that there was somebody who was admitted with corona infection in the hospital, and somebody in South India has kind of gone ahead and made a police complaint against the doctor that it is because of this doctor's hospital that we landed up getting coronavirus infection or some such kind of a thing. So that is what is the situation that we land up with. So let us start with some interesting cases. So this is a case of Mr. A, 65 years old, known case of ischemic heart disease. He is admitted with angina. He dies with about 2 hours post-admission. Now, will you give a death certificate? And if you will give a death certificate, what will be the cause of death for this particular death certificate? The first thing that I want to tell all of you all is this, that cardiorespiratory arrest is not the cause of death. It is the mechanism by which human being dies. Have you ever heard of somebody dying without having cardiorespiratory arrest? The answer is no. Unless until the heart and the respiration stops, human beings are not known to die. So cardiorespiratory arrest is a terminal event which happens before the death. It is not the cause of death. The cause of death can be ischemic heart disease. The cause of death can be pneumonia, tuberculosis, or whatever it may be. It cannot be cardiorespiratory arrest, first of all. Now, obviously, this is a straightforward case. You have a situation, a known case of ischemic heart disease, admitted with angina. You, in 2 hours, you have got enough of evidence, maybe an ECG or whatever that is there to support the cause of death. Maybe it's a ischemic heart disease or whatever that's there. So you are perfectly all right to go ahead and give the cause of death probably as an ischemic heart disease or whatever it is there based on the investigation that you have done in 2 hours. Now let us go to the next situation. Now the same Mr. A has died at home, but you had seen the patient a few months back. Now what do you do in this kind of a situation? Well, since this patient, you have seen this patient, and since this particular patient has been your patient, practically speaking, you are aware of the situation, this patient was under your treatment. So it is important that you go ahead and check the dead body. Check all the signs for the cause of death. Are you finding any doubtful situations such as strangulation marks, etc., etc., etc.? Is the history corroborating with what is being told? Now, since it's a recent past in which you have seen the patient, you are justified in giving cause of death. However, if you have got any kind of a doubt that this could not be the case of ischemic heart disease, then you should refrain from giving cause of death certificate. Now, the next situation is that you have the same patient. Now the patient has not been your patient at all. But he has all the treatment of all medical records that he has undergone. Typically a situation, next door neighbor unfortunately dies. He has never come to you. He has been showing some medical teaching hospital or something of that sort. You have never been a doctor to him at all. In this kind of a situation, you should direct them to their doctor, their physician under whom they were getting treated. But it is advisable that you do refrain from giving cause of death certificate to such kind of a situation. Now let's come to the next situation. Mr. B, 50 years old, my family friend, but not my patient, is brought dead to me. Relatives state that they will take the body to their physician for the death certificate, and since I'm not going to give the certificate. So here you have a situation that there is a dead body in front of you. This particular dead body, I mean, you have confirmed that the death has occurred. You do not know the cause of death for this particular person, but there is some physician who is willing to give cause of death certificate. Now body is in front of you. It is body is in front of you in your clinic or in your hospital. What are your responsibilities and liabilities? It is very clear that if there is another physician under whom this particular patient is under treatment, then it is absolutely justified that that physician clears off and gives the cause of death certificate to this human being. Having said that, there is a possibility that the relatives or whosoever are the people around may play mischief, that they may tell you that they are taking the body to that physician, but you have no clue that what would they do in the meantime or in the interim time. So there are 3-4 practical things that possibly one can do. First and foremost, you could directly connect with that physician. You could tell that physician to identify himself with his medical registration, etc., etc., and at least check that ready to give the cause of death certificate for this particular human being. Now, more or less, if he has kind of given you a go-ahead that yes, he's willing to give a cause of death certificate, then there is generally no reason for the relatives to do any mischief in between. So you are justified in recording all these things down on your paper, that you have spoken to such and such person, etc., etc. And after taking the required consent or a required undertaking from the relatives, it is justified that you can hand over the body to these relatives and they can take the body to that physician. It would be advisable that the physician, if he can come to your place, then it solves all the problems. See, you have to understand one very important thing. Across the country, at most of the places, a particular doctor is given a particular death certificate book, or a particular hospital is given a particular death certificate book. Now, it does not mean that there is some kind of a PCPND type of a situation that this place and this sonography machine. So similarly, this place and this book, no such kind of a correlation exists. So if XYZ physician comes to your hospital or your clinic and uses your death certificate book to issue a cause of death certificate, there is no problem legally speaking, as long as you are providing a mere stationery called as the death certificate printed form given by the municipal corporation or whatever is the local area or local authority. That physician, but he must see to it that he is carrying his stamp, he signs the death certificate, and he proves to you his credentials in the form of giving the registration number, etc., which can be verifiable or it can be verified down the line. So first choice will be to call the physician to your place. Second choice would be to confirm with the physician and then hand over the body. And if you are not able to confirm any of the above, then it would be advisable that you put police into picture by simply informing the police that such and such body is in front of you. They want to take to their own family doctor. You have tried your level best. You are not able to connect with them. So in good faith, you are handing over the body to the relatives with the hope that they will take the body to that particular physician. And after due examination done by that physician, the body or the human being will be given the cause of death certificate. So these are the 3 options that you have got. And there cannot be any 4th option in such kind of a situation, simply because since this particular human being has not been your patient, there is no locus standi, there is no question that you can give cause of death certificate to this particular person. Now, let me come to the next case. Mr. C, a 45 years old human being, underwent a hernioplasty, started complaining of severe chest pain on the 4th day. ECG clearly showed an infarct. Patient was transferred to a particular place and he has died due to an infarct. Now, can you give a death certificate? Now, most of the people are under this kind of a wrong belief that just because a surgery has happened in the past, recent past, it is a medical legal case or it needs to be informed to the police. And well, friends, there is no such kind of a thing. If you have enough cause or if you have enough reason to believe that this particular death can be certified and you have evidence to say that it is because of a natural cause, then you are absolutely justified in giving the cause of death to this particular patient. Okay, now this is something very important. Mr. M or Mrs. M comes from a very good family and dies due to some unknown cause. Now the relatives say that please doctors have avoid a post-mortem. They are willing to sign on any paper that you want, that they don't have any complaints against this fellow, that fellow, against you, etc., etc. And they will try to put all possible types of pressures on you through politicians or through whatever known patients or whatever that is there. It is a very common practice, and we get these calls very frequently from colleagues across the country that this is what is the situation, relatives are pestering me, so can I go ahead and give the cause of death certificate because the relatives are willing to sign on any paper whatever is given to them. So should I go ahead and give the cause of death certificate? Now the simple way to analyze this kind of a situation is this, that ask yourself first question, that do you really know the cause of death? Now in this case, we have said that we can't understand the cause of death. We do not know the cause of death. We do not have any evidence to say that the person has died because of a particular cause. So it means that in my own mind, I do not have absolutely any clue about the cause of death, why this person has died. Now the simple question is this, that if I do not know the cause of death, if I do not know how to justify the cause of death, then what cause of death am I going to write? Just because the relatives say that they have no objection, does it mean that you will come to know the cause of death? Now, it is very important over here to understand that we say in normal parlance that we are giving a death certificate. But actually speaking, ladies and gentlemen, we are not giving a death certificate. We are giving cause of death certificate, which means it is expected that the human being, when he dies, before the further proceedings are done, the cause of death has to be known. Now here we are saying that we do not know the cause of death. Now when we do not know the cause of death, how can we give the cause of death? Just because the relatives say that they don't have any objection, that doesn't mean that you need to fabricate the cause of death. That doesn't mean that you should write as cardiorespiratory arrest and give the cause of death. That is absolutely incorrect, because that goes against the basics, the basic premises of cause of death certificate. Now, death declaration and death certificate are two completely different things, and I will explain to you about these two parameters. It's a very common situation that you are sitting in your clinic, one police walks into your clinic and says that, Dr. Saab, please come with me. Here is one person who is kind of found dead. I suspect that that person is dead. He is on the road. So can you come over and have a look and tell us whether this person is dead or alive? You go, you examine, and you say that no signs of life are there, and that's why you declare him to be dead. That's a different story altogether. Somebody asking you to certify whether death has occurred or no is a different story. But if you are talking of cremation, then the law of the land expects you to have the cause of death certificate. That means it is important that you should be able to prove the cause because of which the death has occurred. Now, in this situation, since you have no clue about the cause of death, it is but natural that one should not give the cause of death certificate and stay very firm on these situations and say that it is not about relatives having objection or no. The fact still remains that you have no clue why the person has become dead, and because you have no clue why the person has died, you have no other alternative but to issue the process through the police in order to find out the cause of death. And then obviously the next step that is expected to be done is to send the body to the forensic experts which are in the government sector or whichever they are, wherever they are, because these situations will differ from place to place. In smaller areas, in smaller PHCs, etc., you do not have forensic experts, but whosoever is the designated officer for the purpose, and it is up to him to decide whether he wants to give the cause of death certificate or he wants to do a post-mortem and give the cause of death or whatever it is there. But my humble request to all of you all is that do not succumb to such kinds of pressures and do not give cause of death certificates unnecessarily to people just because somebody is going to give you. Okay, now these are a few important basics that we need to understand when we give a death certificate. First is filling the columns. Now you have to understand that usually these columns talk of three. There are three such places. So one is supposed to be the immediate cause, second is supposed to be the background cause, and third is supposed to be coexisting morbidities. So you need to fill it up in a proper manner, and then after that you need to inform the police, especially if at all you require to do the post-mortem examination. Now, if you see this slide, I have categorically said inform the police is not equal to doing post-mortem. And let me explain to you what I mean by this. Now, imagine a situation that I have got a patient who has died because of the postpartum hemorrhage. She has undergone a normal delivery, vaginal delivery. She landed up with atonic PPH. I have done a lot of work on her. A lot of blood has been mobilized. A lot of people have come to help. A lot of anesthetists, intensivists, etc., 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 etc. So you have a lot of data to support this particular fact that this was a case of atonic PPH. Now this particular woman has died. In such kind of a situation, you can give the cause of death certificate and not necessarily do the post-mortem examination. And how can you do that is what I'm going to explain to you in this particular slide. Now, on one hand, you have done everything. You have enough reasons to showcase that you dealt with an atonic postpartum hemorrhage because you have right from sonography to so many people to blood to so many such kinds of things. Adequate amount of evidence is there in your hands to showcase that there was a atonic postpartum hemorrhage as the cause of death. On the top of it, probably the relatives are also not making any kind of allegations, and they would say, and they are saying that, okay, we have understood it, you have done your level best, and the woman has died because of postpartum hemorrhage. In such kind of situation, you can take the police into confidence. You have to inform the police for sure because there is a potential medical legal situation, and police could come forward, do the panchanama, take the statement from the relatives. You already know the cause of death, and you should go ahead with the police and say, look, I know the cause of death, but I need to inform you because there's a potential medical legal situation. Now, if you allow me to give the cause of death, I am willing to give the cause of death. And then the police will in turn talk to the relatives and take the no objection certificate from the relatives also. And if the police is convinced, then they will accept the cause of death certificate given by you. And by accepting so, you may be able to avoid the post-mortem in such kind of situation. But mind you, once again, I would like to urge and request all of you all that before doing any such kind of an activity, you should be very sure of the cause of death and you should have enough evidence to back up the cause of death. It should not be in probabilities and in suspicion, but you should have enough amount of evidence to prove if in case you are asked for, and only then you should go ahead. And that too, if it's a medical legal situation, like the person is within your treatment, it's a violent death in few hours, etc., etc., obstetric death, maternal death, etc., etc., then it would be advisable to inform the police, put them in the picture, and probably you might think of avoiding the post-mortem examination. Okay. Now, there are few very important things that I would like to take you to. That is, let me take you from the death issue to the next important issue. And this is where I am going to, actually speaking, give you an anecdotal case. Okay. And this case, and what are the learnings from this case? I was doing a C-section on a patient at 2 o'clock in the night. And at 2 o'clock in the night, it was a placenta previa came with bleeding. So we were already into a situation of panic because she was bleeding torrentially. As soon as I got the baby out, there was a lot of bleeding, typically because of placenta previa, so on and so forth. And suddenly from nowhere, I found that there was a big long catheter which came outside, almost like an epidural catheter which came out from the abdominal incision. Obviously, you can understand it very clearly being gynecologist that I was in a state of shock completely. And I just could not understand that from where has this kind of a catheter come from, something looking like an epidural catheter. The woman has not had an epidural anesthesia. She has undergone a spinal anesthesia. I'm doing a C-section on this particular woman. And suddenly from nowhere, this kind of a catheter has come forward. So I asked this woman Fortunately, she was under spinal anesthesia. So I asked this woman that, did you undergo any kind of a surgery in the childhood? And to my surprise, initially she denied. And then after some time, after repeated prodding, she said that yes, she had developed some kind of a problem for which a VP shunt was put forth in from her brain to her abdominal cavity or peritoneal cavity, obviously to drain the hydrocephalus in the childhood. And she said that, but उसके बाद में मुझे कोई तकलीफ हुई नहीं, तो इसीलिए मैंने आपको कोई उसके बारे में बताया नहीं. Naturally, when I came outside the surgery, I mean, obviously, this was a shocker to me because she had not actually disclosed this to me. I came outside and I immediately fired the patients whosoever relatives were there. And I asked them that why on the earth did they not inform me about this kind of a situation? The patient's father was extremely smart. The patient's father immediately came forward and he said, "Doctor, you don't shout on us. I'm sure that my daughter, who is a very well-educated woman, and she must have told you about this problem. And I'm sure she is not an uneducated or a gawar lady. You people are extremely busy. You people don't have time for the patients. So you only must not have recorded this particular history that she must have given." Fortunately, ladies and gentlemen, I have a system that to all my patients, I give them a pro forma for self-declaration. That means it's a plain simple form which I give to all patients, which the patients are supposed to fill up and give it to me before they enter my consulting room or while I am consulting them. So I opened up this pro forma and I showed the relative that, look, this is your signature, your as in the patient's signature, her handwriting, and do you find anywhere that she has declared that she has got this kind of a problem? And obviously she had not declared this kind of a problem or this past history, just because of the fact that she had not declared it and I had a pro forma in my hand. I was otherwise I was saved. Had that not been the situation, then these people would have taken me for a task. So in short, the learning, and which I want to share with all of you, is that it is a good practice that you also have a self-declaration pro forma for all your patients. It's not a medical legal document, so you need not keep that kind of a paper for 3 years or 2 years or whatever that is there. You may want to kind of, if you can keep it nothing like it, you may want to destroy it maybe post delivery or some such kind of a thing when everything has gone off pretty well and you are sure that now there is no medical legal implication associated with it. But it might be a good idea to have such kind of a pro forma which can significantly help you in order to prevent these kind of allegations that many times the relatives bring on upon us. Okay. Now, there are few very, very important and very, very vital things, and again, very common things that are asked. These are some trivial issues, but which can be absolutely troublesome. Issuing a certificate. It's a very common thing that the relatives come to you. They ask you to issue a certificate, and as a good gesture, just because you want to appease your patients, etc., be friendly with them, etc., you'll end up issuing a certificate. Mind you, ladies and gentlemen, issuing a false certificate by itself is not only an unethical act under the Medical Council of India's Act, but it also can amount to criminal offense such as forgery. So it is a very important thing that you should not issue false certificates to anybody. Kindly see to it that you do not issue certificates without confirming the identity or without seeing the person. We have seen one such kind of a case where a human being was out on a certificate saying that he was admitted in the hospital on such and such date, and actually speaking, he had committed a crime. He had murdered somebody on that particular date, and as a defense against that, he had produced this certificate of the doctor from the hospital saying that he was admitted in the hospital on that particular date, and which was severely kind of so the image of the doctor was severely tarnished in the court. As a matter of fact, he was considered to be one of the persons who are abetting the crime. So minor things of such sort can go a very long way in unnecessarily causing and creating these kinds of problematic situations. You do not know how the people will misuse these kinds of certificates. So that's why one should be very cautious when one issues the medical certificate to anybody. Now, another very common question that is asked is this, that do you or should you or how long should you keep the outdoor case papers? Now, we obviously know that we have a lot of case papers that get created, a lot of letterheads or whatever you want, you must be using, which are the outdoor case paper. These are not the people who are getting admitted in the hospital. They are outdoor patients who come for your consultation. Now, if we look at the Code of Medical Ethics, which is what is the law that is supposed to be followed, then the Code of Medical Ethics, primarily speaking, puts responsibility on you to keep the indoor case papers for a period of 3 years. It does not talk anything about the outdoor case papers. It is but natural that if you can keep the outdoor papers, it obviously will be more helpful because you will be able to prove your point in case of a medical legal problem. But prima facie, the law of the land does not expect you to store the outdoor case papers in your own clinic or practice. But indoor case papers are expected to be kept for a period of about 3 years. And after that, according to the Code of Medical Ethics, you can consider destroying these kinds of papers. Obviously, there are exceptions. The most important exception is all medical legal cases. So if there is a medical legal case, it could be an accident case, it could be whatever case. If it's a medical legal case, then till the case is not resolved, it is expected that you must keep these papers. If it comes to the issue of MTP, then papers related to MTP must be kept for a period of 5 years and you should not destroy them after a period of 3 years. Income tax generally expects people to keep the relevant documents up to a period of 8 years. So different laws demand different kinds of things. According to my understanding, it is the income tax which expects people to keep the whatever relevant papers for the longest period of time. So in my practice, what I do is this: I destroy the papers after the period of 8 years. So far, we have got many such kind of questions. People have asked these questions that can an unborn fetus after the age of becoming major, that is after 21 years, can that person come forward and sue you and all that kind of things. So many such kind of theoretical questions have been put to us as medical legal experts. But let me tell you, friend, that there has been no such kind of a case. As a matter of fact, there have been cases which have come forward after 6, 7, 8 years. And the doctors, we have suggested the doctors to go ahead and straight away tell the court that I am duty bound to follow the Code of Medical Ethics, and under the Code of Medical Ethics, my job was to keep the papers for 3 years. So I do not have any case papers. And once the Code of Medical Ethics is cited, the courts have not considered the doctor to be ab initio negligent. Now I must explain to you what do I mean by this particular word. There are certain things which just merely by doing them, they are considered to be wrong. So to give an example, you have given a wrong certificate. There is no question why you gave certificate and under what pressure you gave the certificate. You gave a wrong certificate or you gave a certificate, false certificate, ab initio is wrong. Similarly, not keeping papers for more than 3 years is not considered to be an ab initio wrong kind of a thing. However, of course, I mean, if you have your own case papers, whether from outdoor or indoor, it will obviously be much more helpful for you to defend your case in a better manner. So if you can keep it for longer period of time, nobody is stopping you from doing so. But the law of the land will not expect you to keep the papers for more than 3 years, and according to income tax, not more than 8 years. Now let me talk to you a little bit more about the liability of a clinic towards the relatives who are coming to the hospital. Now this is supposed to be a vicarious liability. Classically speaking, an example in this, typically speaking, you know, these things typically happen in big corporate hospitals, that a relative falls down. He is not technically speaking your patient. The relative falls down because he slips from on the floor. A floor is kept wet and the relative falls down. And then can the liability come onto the clinic? And the answer is yes, that it may come onto the clinic, although there is no doctor-patient relationship that is established between that person and the hospital. Of course, these cases are decided on case-to-case basis, on factual basis, and that is why there is a possibility of such kind of a sort. So that's why it is advisable that all establishments look after not only the patients, but some rules and regulations even for the relatives are put forth and they are followed on regular basis. There was a typical case where a pediatrician was trying to open an ampule, and while doing so, a piece of glass flew from the pediatrician's hand and went into the eye of the relative. Okay, and naturally, because it went into the eye of the relative sued the doctor for being negligent, etc., etc. So such kinds of cases do happen. So it is always advisable that you have a clear policy, you have a clear structure, so that you do not have, or you do not land up with such kind of situations. Now, last and the most important thing, in terms of examination of female patients, of course, most of the gynecologists are very well versed with this particular fact that when a male doctor is examining a female patient, there a female chaperone has to be there in that particular clinic or that particular place. In spite of repeatedly telling these particular things to doctors across the country, we have so many times found even male gynecologists examining the females or dealing with the females. It could be just a matter of just seeing the reports or whatever that is there. They are doing it on their own without having a female chaperone in front of them. So it is my earnest request to all the doctors, particularly all the gynecologists and male gynecologists and male doctors, that kindly do not entertain a woman patient in front of you in your chamber if there is no female chaperone available. These things can go, because nobody has any kind of a recording. These are private places. You can't put a camera over there. And that's why it will be the female's voice that will always be voiced in front and it will be believed. So it's always a good idea to have a female chaperone when a male doctor is doing this examination as regards patients are concerned. Okay. Now let's come to a few important topics. Let's talk a little bit more about the consent. Now, on an average, we need to understand that consent can be written consent, it can be implied consent, or it can be oral consent. To give you an example, written consent, we all know that for any major surgery, we take a form which is signed, etc., etc., etc. You have something which is called as a written consent. Oral consent is something whereby you are orally taking the consent, it's not documented. And implied consent is something whereby just merely the act of the patient in front of you implies that the patient is consenting. So more or less it is considered that a woman who walks into the gynecologist's clinic has given an implied consent for examination of the person. If you want to do a simple intramuscular injection, then you are expected to take oral consent. That means you will explain the patient that I want to give a tetanus toxoid injection. Are you okay, willing? Please lie down. I will give you tetanus toxoid injection. Generally, by the law of the land or by the current practices and standards, all those kinds of procedures which are not major, which do not have great side effects, and which are done on conscious patients who can understand what they are saying, you can do these procedures by doing an oral consent. So, say a tooth extraction, it is all right to do it with an oral consent. However, if at all you are going to give, let's say, chemotherapy agent, even if you are not giving anesthesia, it will be important that you take written consent for these kinds of things. Now, I am going to talk a little bit more about how do you take the consent and what all things are required to be done. There is a very important judgment, okay, which has been delivered by Supreme Court, by the Apex Court. That judgment is called as Dr. Prabha Manchanda's case. So I would request all of you to Google this word Dr. Prabha Manchanda, go to this particular judgment. It's a beautiful piece of judgment, and it is very important that we understand that what is written in this judgment. First and foremost, I want to say that we always keep on using the word, as regards when it comes to consent, we use the word informed consent. Now, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that legally speaking, this informed consent is supposed to be an American system or American postulate, whereby in India, according to the Supreme Court judge who has delivered this judgment and which forms the basic framework of consent and the law related to that, we are supposed to follow a UK principle, which is called as real consent principle. And in real consent principle, what is expected is that we are expected to inform the patient about the basic nature of the procedure, the benefits as well as the downsides of the procedure, the alternatives to a given particular procedure, what would happen to her if no treatment is done, and lastly, we are expected to give outline of substantial risks that are involved. In typical informed consent principle, that is American principle, it is expected that you tell, practically speaking, about the most uncommon complication to that particular person in front of you. In short, because we are supposed to follow the UK standard, we are not in India expected to give the most rarest complication or details about the rarest complication to the patient in front of you. We are expected to give an outline of the substantial risks which are involved. So coming back to the point, you are expected to give the nature of the procedure, the benefits of the procedure, advantages and disadvantages, choices that are available, what would happen if nothing is done at all, and lastly, the outline of substantial risk. If you have documented these many things, then you are absolutely all right to go ahead with the procedure. Just a plain kind of a form, okay, which is a blanket consent form. It says that you are giving a consent to do any procedure by any doctor, by any anesthesiologist, under any anesthesia, for anything and everything under the sun. Such kind of blanket consents do not hold any kind of a benefit as regards the process of consenting in the legal parlance is concerned. So it is important that you should individualize this consent form. One could just make the patient write a simple sentence in his or her own handwriting saying that XYZ things have been explained to him in the language which I understand. And that also is enough to personalize that particular consent form, and it will go in long ways to protect you from potential medico-legal liability. Obviously, the next point, that is language of consent, I've already said that in India, which is a very diverse country, you have so many such kinds of situations that somebody does not understand the given particular language, and you might have a form which is in your state language or in Hindi or in English or whatever that is there. So it's always a good idea that you have a sentence which is written by this person. Now, the question is that I have opened up somebody's abdomen and I find some more extra pathology. By treating that pathology, I am very sure that I am going to do benefit only to the patient. So should I go ahead and do this particular treatment? To give you an example, I have put in a laparoscope. I am doing a diagnostic hysterolaparoscopy, and I find that she has got a large dermoid cyst, or she has got a large chocolate cyst. Now, should I go ahead and operate on this particular woman and do an operative surgical procedure? The law is very clear on this particular point, that even if you are doing it in the best interest of the patient, even if you are saving another surgical procedure, another piece of expenditure for the patient, even if you have got all good intentions, since you have not taken consent of the person, you are not going to touch such kind of things when the consent has not been taken. The only exception is if you are going to do a life-saving procedure. To give you an example, I am doing a C-section, there is severe postpartum hemorrhage. I require to do an obstetric hysterectomy to save the life of the woman. Without any consent, if you go ahead and do the surgery, you will be absolutely upright in the eyes of the law, because the procedure that you did was in the best interest to save the life of the woman. There have been many such kinds of judgments. If need be, I can share them with you, that somebody has gone ahead and done a postpartum hemorrhage ke liye obstetric hysterectomy. Patient has later on tried to sue the doctor, but the courts have taken a view that it was a life-saving procedure. Doctor was not held responsible. However, a typical case which I told you about, diagnostic hysterolaparoscopy and an additional operative procedure, and something goes wrong in these kinds of situations, you will be held liable. In fact, the Prabha Manchanda case, where Samira Kohli versus Prabha Manchanda case, actually speaking of is of the similar kind of a sort. So even if you are doing it in the best interest, it's a good idea not to touch. Now, one can be extra smart by saying that I am going to do a diagnostic SOS operative intervention for fertility enhancement. If you have taken a consent for an SOS operative surgical procedure, and you have taken the consent and permission from the patient to take a go ahead from the patient for an operative surgical procedure, then you are justified in going ahead and treating or doing an operative laparoscopy for the patient. But if your consent is only for a diagnostic laparoscopy or a hysteroscopy, it is not expected that you will go ahead and do an operative procedure, especially so when it is not a life-saving procedure. So I hope that I have made it very clear. If at all there are any confusions, that I will be definitely able to take these questions when we are going ahead. Now, in the meantime, can I have the organizers and the administrators to let us know about how are we faring in terms of the time? A. Second, how many number of questions have you got? B. And how many people are going on with us in the seminar? Point C. Can Abhijit or anybody tell me, please?
Yes, sir. So total number of users right now is 481.
Okay.
And we have around, just a minute, sir. And we have around, sir, 35 questions. Out of these, relevant seems to be around 25.
Okay, great. Okay, and how are we faring in terms of the time?
Sir, 5 minutes left.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I will be taking few important issues now since we don't have much of time left. Okay, now this is something which is very, very vital. A very common case scenario, a missed swab which is left. Okay, and I am showing you an X-ray of a missed swab. Now, ladies and gentlemen, most of the people are under the impression that especially the swabs which have got the radio tag or which have got a radio opaque tape inside the mop will be very easy to get diagnosed on an X-ray. But I will show you this. This can you appreciate after seeing it very, very, very carefully that there is a thin line which can be seen over here just over the left sacroiliac joint. And actually speaking, this is that radio opaque wire which you can see, which is actually speaking coming from the swab. The point that I want to kind of tell you about is that although it is our impression or a misimpression that if there is a mop which is left inside, it is very easy to get diagnosed. A plain simple X-ray also will be able to give you the answer, particularly if you are using a radio tag or a mop which has got or a swab which has got a radio opaque tape or whatever it is there. Actually speaking, it is not a tape, it is just like a thread, and it is particularly very difficult because this is going to be a foreign body inside the abdomen. There will be a lot of gas fluid shadows, there will be a lot of gas inside and fluid shadows inside, paralytic ileus, so on and so forth, and these things are very, very, very likely to get missed out. A case of a missed swab or a missed mop or a foreign body inside somebody's abdominal cavity is, practically speaking, a non-defendable medical legal situation. So you have no defense of any nature at all when you are dealing with this situation. And that's why this is a pure and sure shot recipe to lose this kind of a case. And when you know that this is a sure shot recipe to lose this kind of a case, why can't we not be more careful? And that's why I call this as a lifesaver board, that I have made it absolutely mandatory, come what may, and no compromises of any nature in terms of this particular issue, that before I do any abdominal surgery or any cavitatory surgery, unless and until these things are counted and written on the board, sacrosanctly I do not allow the surgery to get started. This is the only sure shot and perfect recipe to avoid problems and complications and avoiding medical issues down the line that you will face. Now, the next question that I'm going to deal with is about how do you treat the medical emergence. Let us imagine a situation that you are doing a gynec obstetric practice, you have got a nursing home or a clinic or whatever it may be. It's a pure obstetric gynec kind of a setup, and somebody comes to you or a patient has been brought to you in an acute stage of emergency. A male is brought to you with chest pain or with whatever that is there, and you know it very, very surely that this is out of the purview of your medical practice or your specialty. The million-dollar question that comes to the mind is this: that is it fair and fine to refuse treatment to this particular patient? Now, I completely understand that the ground realities are completely different, but I am telling you what the law says about these situations. There have been number of cases on this particular issue. Parvat Kumar, Parmanand Katara, many of them, and now the law of the land also clearly says that any kind of an emergency medical services that have to be provided must be provided by the doctor. What is expected from the doctor is a quick triaging is done, a basic treatment or resuscitation is done, stabilization is done, and transportation is done. Ladies and gentlemen, being a gynecologist, I am completely with you on this point that even if it is only 4 words, it means something much more, than what it means. To give you an example, imagine a situation that an ophthalmologist is sitting in his clinic and a lady who is 8 centimeters dilated in labor is brought to him. So how do you kind of do a triage? He may not be aware how to do a PV examination. How do you stabilize the woman? Because delivery is only stabilization. How do you transport? Who is going to provide for the transport? So these are some very relevant and practical problems that we face. Unfortunately, when these kinds of cases were fought in the Supreme Court, none of the people from the medical fraternity, neither our medical councils, nor the associations, represented and gave a very clear practical viewpoint on these kinds of things. They could have intervened actually in this situation, but it is a sad state of affairs that at the right time, the bodies, whether the councils or the associations, do not intervene, and that's why you end up having such kinds of judgments. Now this judgment is going to be a miserable judgment for us. We are expected to treat, triage, stabilize, and even transport this patient after doing basic resuscitation. If at all one does not do it, then it will be held that you have done a wrong as far as the law of the land is concerned. This is what is your medical liability and a legal liability. Now you can always find out ways and means by intelligently utilizing your things, but this is what is expected to be a medical legal liability that you have when you kind of deal with such kinds of things. Now, these are few do's and don'ts. As what I said, that you can't just simply turn away. You need to first treat and only then charge. You need to first treat and only then make an MLC if it's an accident case or whatever that is there. And it is important that primarily speaking, you do not turn away patients when they need a life-saving measures or life-saving situations are there in front of you. I think the last thing that I will talk, and probably I think that should be the last few slides which are left now, is that the care or the medical legal liability that one incurs when one is transferring the patient from one place to another place. And this is again a very classical case. Mr. Shakil Wakil Khan was a person who was kind of getting shifted from one hospital to another hospital. Now here what had happened, the facts of the case was that he was getting shifted from one hospital to the other hospital. The doctor who was there, the doctor, primarily speaking, decided that he would kind of put the patient in the ambulance. So naturally, the patient was put into the ambulance. The relative said that we want to sit with the patient. So the doctor obliged, doctor made the relative sit in the ambulance, and doctor actually followed the ambulance in his car back to back. It took about 20 to 25 minutes for them to reach the hospital. And as soon as they reached the casualty of the hospital, at casualty, it was found that the patient was found dead when the patient was brought into the casualty. Now this case went into the court, and the doctor said that I was diligent enough. I followed up with the ambulance. I was immediately back sitting into the car next to the ambulance, so on and so forth. But it was considered that it is not a correct thing to do, that a doctor should accompany the patient, especially when the doctor is in a serious condition. I mean to say patient is in a serious condition, and when you are transferring the patient from one place to another. So this means that it is absolutely important that some doctor, if you are there, nothing like it, but some doctor needs to accompany the patient in the ambulance in an emergency situation when the patient is getting transferred from one hospital to another hospital. And I would recommend that when you accompany a patient to another big hospital, please see to it and request the casualty medical officer to even enter this particular fact in their notes, that this particular patient reached the hospital on whatever time frame, etc., 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 and was brought in by Dr. ABC, that is you who have accompanied the patient. So because this is another recipe for a medical legal protection when such kind of things happen as far as the courts are concerned. I think let me, okay, so I think let me take only this last probably question. Now, many a times, and this so particularly happens with the corporate hospitals, which are coming in great numbers today in the country, more so in the cities, in big cities as well as in the little smaller cities. Now, we have to understand that if at all we fight amongst ourselves, whether it is the hospital administration, the anesthetist, the surgeon, etc., etc., then it's again one of the most important winning recipe for the patient, because the patient just simply puts the allegation, and then there is a fight between the surgeon, the anesthesiologist, and the hospital administration. Each one of them says that this is not my ball. This is not the ball in my court. And in the bargain, you keep on exposing the points of the another colleague or the hospital. Collectively, it's a brilliant kind of a set pitch for the opposite party, that means for the patient, and the judges are just going to enjoy this, because you are only going to give, all of you all only are going to give the negative side of the story about each other, and ultimately all of you all are going to doom. That is precisely the reason for which it is very important that you form a cohesive team. I have many a times even instructed the corporate people, the corporate hospital administrators, and if there are any in this particular webinar or seminar, it is my earnest request that when you are drafting the contracts, many of the times these contracts are drafted by the lawyers, and lawyers do not understand these nitty-gritties. Lawyers just want to take safeguarding measures of their client, and hence lawyers will always keep on writing that any liability, I will pass it on to the surgeon, or I will pass it on to the consultant. I will not take any responsibility. In the bargain, what will happen is this, that if there is a doubtful situation or a problematic situation, that doctor has to safeguard himself. So he does not want his neck into the noose. So he is going to say that, well, infrastructure was not adequate. The hospital is going to say the doctor was not proper. And in the fight, it's a perfect recipe to lose the case. So it is very important that you have been working together as a cohesive team. You need to fight it also as a cohesive team. Saath jiyenge, saath marenge has to be the principle for a winning recipe for winning such kind of medical legal cases. I think I have not been able to kind of fully finish off with my slides, but I think it will be an important thing that we take few question answers. If at all after doing the question answers, if we are left with some more time, then I can deal with few of the other questions. I think let us halt at this point of time, at least take few questions, and maybe after taking few questions, maybe we can think of going back to the presentation. If time permits, we will be able to do that. Is that okay, Abhijit sir?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. So now let me go to the link whereby I get the access. Okay, so I do have few questions here. Okay, we have some 50 odd questions which I can see. Okay. Okay, Abhijit sir, can you kind of tell me how do I reach the questions?
Sir, comment section. Users, near that
sorry.
there is comment section.
Yes, yes, that's it. Yes, we told me that. Yes, correct. Okay, so there are a few questions which let us take them. Okay, Dr. Gayatri has asked this question. In fact, she had asked this question long time back about a policy, a life insurance policy for private hospital, all doctors and nursing staff, and how about the dependent. I think Dr. Gayatri madam, I think you are not asking me about life insurance, because life insurance has got nothing to do with the liability as a professional. I think you are asking me about the professional policy, which means that if, let's say, all doctors and nursing staff is there, or even your unqualified staff is there, and if they, during their course of work, if at all they have landed up having or creating some kind of a problem, then can you have a policy which can cover you for? I suppose that is what is the question that you have asked for. And yes, there is a policy. The name of the policy is called as errors and omission policy. Most of the large PSU insurance companies like Oriental, etc., 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 have this kind of a policy. We very regularly, I have also taken the policy for both my clinics. This policy is supposed to be taken by the nursing home owner in the name of the nursing home, and it is supposed to cover all the qualified as well as unqualified people for the deeds that they do during the course of their work in the hospital. So it's called as errors and omission policy. I would very strongly recommend that any doctor who is practicing in this particular country cannot practice the way we do not practice without having a registration number. Similarly, no doctor, even if it's a standalone single doctor practitioner, should never practice without having a professional indemnity policy. Now, mind you, professional indemnity policy is supposed to be taken by a professional. That means the doctor will take it for himself. But if the doctor wants to cover his staff, then he has to take a separate policy that is called as errors and omission policy. Okay. Second question asked by Dr. Nisha Singh, and actually many of them have asked this question. Can you give an opinion to a patient by using a telemedicine platform? Well, till 27th of March, this was not technically speaking a legal kind of a thing. But as and what I said, that the board of governors, now that MCI is suspended, there is a board of governors. Now, in the wake of Corona, board of governors have actually created a telemedicine guideline, and it becomes the annexure 5 to the Code of Medical Ethics. And under this particular guideline, giving telephonic consultation is an absolute okay as regards medical practitioners are concerned. Mind you, that it is very categorically said that it is not for a temporary period only till the Corona problem is going to be solved or something of that sort. It is expected that the telemedicine becomes a part and parcel of their regular practice. That's a normal kind of a practice. So telemedicine is here to stay. Of course, there are a lot of restrictions. The guidelines have been put forth. Even if you just simply Google telemedicine guidelines, probably you can find that. I have a different lecture, an independent lecture on telemedicine, the do's and don'ts and medical legal safety. So if I suppose I had done a video on it, it had become viral. If that video has not reached you, probably you could find that video on my YouTube channel. So you can go to Dr. Nikhil Datar on YouTube, and you will be able to find my channel there, and you can watch that video. Or I could do an independent separate lecture if anybody wants me to do that. Okay, very interesting question. And Dr. Parag Patil. Okay, so I'm happy to have Parag over here. So he has asked this question that during COVID pandemic, just as usual rights of citizens are suspended, is CPA suspended too? It's a very interesting question. Well, first of all, the usual rights of citizens are not suspended, Parag. There is no emergency that has been declared, typically speaking. So currently what has been declared is, it is declared to be a a pandemic act or a disaster management act has been put into place. There is no emergency which has been declared. Now, when emergency gets declared, then the rights of the citizens get suspended and enormous powers go into the hands of the public servants or people at the helm of affairs. Acts do not get suspended, the rights can get suspended, and the rights, primarily speaking, are fundamental rights that can get suspended. But in this situation, it's an epidemic act or the epidemic act which is in place, and nobody's rights are suspended. They are abrogated in certain ways which are related to epidemic related problems. So that is why no rights are suspended at this point of time. It's a very interesting question that you have asked. Okay. Then we will take the next question. Okay. Is it mandatory to test every indoor patient for elective C-section, etc. for COVID? Again, Parag has asked this question, Dr. Parag Patil. Well, the honest answer is no. And there is no legal answer to this particular question because it will be entirely dependent on the advisories that we get from time to time from the various governments. Now, these advisories are based on number of factors, including the prevalence of a particular problem in that particular area or zone, or typically which is called as containment zone. Now, you all must be aware that Bhilwara model and the Ministry of Family Welfare, Government of India has come up with a plan that they want to have. And mind you that as far as this plan is concerned, there are different sets of rules which are applicable based on the prevalence of COVID in that particular area. So my suggestion to you will be that you need to follow not only a particular guideline or something of that sort, but you need to also follow the guidelines from your local corporation, because there could be a district which would have a different set of rules and regulations for you, and you need to follow those kinds of things. In next week, I think with some other company, I am going to do a panel discussion on COVID and exactly what all things a common gynecologist needs to know. So I would request you to stand by for it and kind of come into that seminar, and we'll be able to give you a lot of suggestions in this. A lot of questions, I think, on online consultation, WhatsApp consultation, many of those kinds of questions I can see over here. So maybe if Abhijit wants to take it up, he could organize for one another seminar on online consultation, because there seems to be a lot of questions. So we can very happily deal with them in a more aggressive manner, in a full-fledged manner. Dr. Aryan Tiwari has asked this question: respected sir, if a gynecologist is present in ultrasound room and he is well versed with what features are to be looked for gender identification, he gets to know the gender of the child. Being a doctor, we do not have any thoughts of gender discrimination, but how far is this situation medico-legally correct or justifiable? I could not get this question, really speaking. Well, your job under the PCPNDT Act is your obligation and responsibility. That is, you are not going to disclose, and you are going to follow the rules to the T. However stupid they are, according to me, it is one of the greatest examples of a misfired missile. You had a brilliant target in your mind, but you aimed and angled the missile only in the wrong direction initially. So it was never supposed to reach the target, and it never reached the target, but naturally. And that is what it means basically. But we are not getting into that issue. As a gynecologist or a radiologist or whatever you may be, your job is to see to it that you do not do what you are not supposed to be doing. And that's the end of it. Besides that, whosoever wants to find out or do whatever, that is their problem. You are not responsible for it. Okay. Dr. Hiren Tumar, a very interesting question. Again, I'm taking it because I have found few questions which are related to this particular topic. Well, there are many questions coming in and lots of them flowing in. So I'm taking the common themes, practically speaking, and trying to kind of once again going back to that. Well, basically what is being asked is this, that a media personnel tries to defame you. Now, what is the counteractive mechanism or counteractive method that one could employ to deal with such kind of a situation? That is what, primarily speaking, is the question. So what are the rights of the doctors, or what rights do the doctors have against a media professional who has wrongly defamed that person is what is the question. Well, the fact of life is this, that if anybody defames you, then you have a way to file a defamatory suit against that person. Defamation is a civil crime, civil as well as a criminal kind of an offense. It means that you can file a criminal case against a person, or you can file a civil case that's for the sake of compensation. You can also go to the Press Council of India and complain over there. Now, the biggest problem that many of the times that happens is this, that it is a sad state of affairs that these media people are a very organized sector. They have ongoing lawyers who are kind of representing them on regular basis to the courts of law. Whereas if the doctor needs to take up this particular matter against the media, then the doctor will have to go to the court, doctor will have to employ a lawyer, etc., etc. So although you may be able to win the case, it's a long-standing hardship that the doctor has to go through. It's a sad state of affairs, but that is what it is. And just because most of the people will not want to go through this kind of a thing, because it is a very hard situation to go through. It's a lot of hardships that they have to go through. That's why many of the people, unfortunately, will not want to take this up. But well, it doesn't mean that you cannot take it. Of course, you have a lot of power to do so. You have a lot of remedies to do so. You can file a defamatory suit. Even criminal case can be filed against a particular person, but you will have to prove that there was a criminal intention in the mind of the other person, and you can go ahead and file a criminal case against the person. Well, Dr. Manisha Laddad has asked this question, can you send us a pro forma of a negative history? Well, I can send you a pro forma, but it's a very plain, simple kind of thing. I think what I can do for you is, let me see. Well, it is quite possible for you to create one for yourself, but let me give you a quick answer to the question. Okay, let me share the screen.
Sir, please do the full screen.
Yes. Okay, are you able to see the screen that I'm sharing now?
Sir, you have to do the full screen. Presentation mode.
No, this is not. Okay, 1 second. Yeah, is this better now? So this is not a presentation. What I've done is this, that I am taking you to a particular website. You can just click the photograph if you want to of this particular page, patientsafetyalliance.in. Okay, I was introduced as the founder president of Patient Safety Alliance. And if you go over here, there are few tools. One of the tools is tool for effective communication, effective doctor-patient communication. Few of these kinds of tools can come very handy. This is not exactly about negative history, but it does to a great extent talk about the negative history. So you can evaluate your own forms based on this, and that can turn out to be very easy for you. This particular form, particularly this form for effective doctor-patient communication, is a brilliant form that you can put to use when you are dealing with such kind of situations. So I think probably this might be a very good idea for you to use. I hope that I am able to kind of do justice to the question that Dr. Manisha Laddad had asked. Okay. Dr. Manju Shukla has asked this question, that is there any need for consent for COVID-19 exclusion before elective C-section? And again, I've already answered this question. There was one very short 2-minute video that I had done, which went viral just a few days back, about whether there is a need of a specific consent about COVID-19. Again, this video you can see on my YouTube channel. You can simply go to YouTube and type Dr. Nikhil Datar, and you will be able to reach out this particular video. The gist is that you do not require to take a specific consent for this. The reasons you could probably find if you go to my YouTube channel and find it. Then we will come to the next question. How much time do we have? Dr. Abhijit, can you tell me how much
time, sir? Take your time, sir. No issue, sir.
Okay, all right, okay. Okay, then we have a question that Dr. Megha Jain has asked this question. If the consent is in English and patient only understands Hindi, can we take in writing from the patient? One second. Can we take in writing from the patient in Hindi at the bottom of the consent, as the above has been explained? Well, Dr. Megha Jain, I must congratulate you. This is exactly what I was trying to tell you and tell everybody, that even if you have a form of consent which is in English, it's a brilliant idea that you make the patient write in his own language, that the above mentioned things have been explained to him in his language. So if he's a Hindi guy, we would expect him to write कि ऊपर लिखी हुई सभी चीजें मुझे हिंदी में बताई गई है और जो मुझे समझ में आई है. So you can always make them write this sentence. In fact, it might be a brilliant piece of idea that you could write these sentences in the most common languages and keep it ready on your table. So whenever your staff nurse is taking the consent, she gives the consent form and gives that kind of a pre-printed pre-printed sentence written in Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, whichever languages, common languages you kind of land up seeing. So the person from that particular language just simply needs to copy what he wants to copy from that particular language, and that can solve a problem very simply. Okay. Dr. Parul Kapoor has asked this question: can an assistant come out and explain the relatives and take another consent for that additional surgery? No. This is exactly what happened in Samira Kohli versus Prabha Manchanda. The court, this is exactly what was done in this case. They started doing a diagnostic hysterolaparoscopy for a severe endometriosis. Ultimately, they decided to do hysterectomy. Somebody came out and took the consent of the mother or somebody, and they went ahead and did the hysterectomy. And this particular case, they have lost. Dr. Prabha Manchanda lost this particular case. This is exactly what was done, and that is precisely the reason for which you should not do this particular thing unless what you are doing is to save the life of the woman. This is very important, to save the life of the woman. Only if you are going to see something which is going to save the life of the woman, it is justified for you to go ahead and do. If at all that is not the case, then you are not going to do it. If at all only one more surgery is going to be avoided, no. However, which is what I explained earlier on, that if you are smart enough and you have taken a consent for an additional procedure beforehand, which means, let's give an example, that I say that I am doing a diagnostic laparoscopy, SOS, operative intervention for ovarian cyst treatment, operative intervention for adhesiolysis, operative intervention for treating endometriosis, then you are justified in going ahead to do the surgery. But otherwise, answer is no, you are not justified in doing the surgery. Okay. Dr. Chandrakala Patil has asked this question: is it important to get High Court order for MTP beyond 20 weeks? Is the baby's anoma? It is obviously but natural. See, you have to understand this. The current law of the land, that is MTP Act of 1971, does not allow you to terminate the pregnancy beyond 20 weeks, come what may, except if you are terminating the pregnancy to immediately save the life of the woman. Now, what do you mean by immediately to save the life of the woman? A placenta previa is bleeding torrentially at 22 weeks, and that's why you do a hysterectomy and do an MTP. You are doing it to immediately save the life of the woman. So you are justified in doing it. Anomalous baby is not immediately to save the life of the woman. That means the current law of the land does not allow you to terminate the pregnancy, even anencephaly, beyond 20 weeks. I was the person who filed the first case, and I was the person who have filed the famous case Nikhil Datar versus Union of India in the Supreme Court. And I have helped more than 130 women across the country to file cases pro bono without charging any money, and courts have given them permissions to terminate their pregnancies. That is exactly the reason for which the law of the land is going to get amended. Please understand that the ministry, the cabinet has given a nod and approval for the amendment of the law, but the law has not yet been passed. It has to get passed in the parliament, both the houses. Then the ministry or the government is supposed to declare that this law will be applicable on a particular date. And only after that particular declaration in the government gazette, the new, that is amended law will come into force. Now, the expected amendments or the amendments which have been suggested are A, for severe abnormal fetuses, and the list they will be bringing up. Termination can be done at any point of time. Of course, with some kind of an understanding, there could be some boards that they would create, at certain hospitals in the state, etc., etc. But prima facie, it is possible for them, for people to terminate the pregnancies beyond 20 weeks for substantial abnormalities. Or it would be the case for minor rape survivors or single mothers up to 24 weeks. But mind you, at this point of time, the law is not yet amended. Until such time the law is not amended, I would refrain to suggest that you should carry out a termination of pregnancy beyond 20 weeks without the court order. If you require to help a woman to get the court order, please connect with me. I will be most happy to help them. I do this work free of cost, and I'll be most happy to do this work. Okay, so we are almost at about 5:30. There are lots of questions which are coming up, but I think we are almost at the end of our timing. So I think I will have to close this seminar at this point of time. I would only take the last important question that comes from Preeti Moon. She says that she is registered with Punjab Medical Council, and can she practice in Haryana without registration with Haryana Medical Council? Well, madam, the fact of life is this, that you require to register with Haryana Medical Council too, because you are registered with Punjab Medical Council is not enough for you to prima facie practice with Haryana Medical Council. It is required that you apply to Haryana Medical Council and get yourself registered with the Haryana Medical Council too. I think Abhijit, we will have to wind up this seminar at this point of time, but there are lots of questions which are unanswered. Yes, I think you might want to kind of, I don't know, maybe have another session of question answer if you want to, or but telemedicine is one thing a lot of people are asking questions about. So maybe that's what you can think of. So I think I hand over the whole control of webinar to Dr. Abhijit Malvi. They have been very kind. Thank you, Inca, once again for giving this brilliant opportunity. Dr. Abhijit is a senior medical advisor with Inca. So this was his brainchild, primarily speaking, and Mr. Manish Shah, who is in the senior management at Inca. So once again, thank you very much for joining in. Close to about 500 odd people across the country. It only says and shows the amount of interest that people have in this particular topic. And once again, wishing all of you all absolute safety, at home with the required social distancing. So stay safe at home. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for patient hearing. Over to you, Abhijit.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such a wonderful lecture. Your delivery was so engaging that we lost all track of time. I hope audience has gained a lot of insights. I would like to thank all our participants for taking their time out for this webinar. I'd like to thank our BU head, Mr. DP Satpathy sir, and divisional head, Mr. Manish Shah sir, for making this event possible. Have a nice day ahead. Thank you. Goodbye.
Sorry, one small little request, Abhijit, yes, that sir, by any chance, if you are likely to keep this seminar, okay, I mean, if you have recorded this seminar and if you are going to keep it live for a few more days or something of that sort, okay, sir, you might want to tell that also to the audience, because they might want to revisit it, or they might want to share this link with other doctors who can kind of later on see. So if you can throw some light on this issue.
Sir, with your permission, we can send a link, sir, to our doctors.
Sure.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. With your permission, sir, with your due permission, we can send this link to all our doctors, sir.
All right. So I will just give my email address. If at all anybody wants to connect with me, then please write down my email address. That is DR, that is short form of Dr. Nikhil, that is NIKHIL 70@hotmail.com. So if anybody wants to connect, you are free to connect. I will try and help as much as I can. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for patient hearing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank
of
you,
you.
sir.